Hey, I'm Nick DiMatteo, and welcome to Music is Not a Genre, the Music is Everything edition. In this edition, I take a musical concept, idea, fact, belief, opinion, philosophy. I discuss it at length. I unravel it. I bust myths. I connect it to things outside the music world. This is, for those of you listening on podcast platforms and not watching on my YouTube channel or on Patreon, this is Season 3, Episode 5. So welcome. We're deep into it if you're already here at Season 3. And thank you for listening. Thanks to those of you who are watching on my YouTube channel, for anyone who subscribes, who clicks, who shares, who comments. I love comments. I love conversation. And especially thank you to my Patreon supporters who get to see this first. This week is a doozy. You're in for it. Let me just tell you, you're in for it. And I'm super excited about this. I'm excited about the general topic, and I'm excited about the specifics that I get into afterwards. So instead of talking about it, let me just do it. Today, as always, you know, I start by reading this wonderful text I have here. Here, screenshot. You ready? All right. If you're watching on video, screenshot. If not, the text is below for those of you on the other platforms. Yeah, that's right. Those are all my notes. And let me get into it. This week's title is, What's a chronolography? Chronolography. And why does it make the Bee Gees way more awesomer? When David Bowie died 5 years ago, I righted a big wrong. I'd been aware of him since the 1970s, knew some of his hits and 80s music and offshoots like Tin Machine, someone I really respected but kept at arm's length. So I fixed that and listened to his entire catalog. I was immediately hooked, not just on Bowie's legendary shape-shifting music, but on the whole idea of listening to entire catalogs. So I did it again and again and again. I'm still doing it. At last count, I've gone through well over 50 artist discographies. Truth be told, it's probably more like 150 to maybe 1,000 if you count all the short-lived bands. I call this a chronolography. It's a mashup of chronology and discography, and here's how I do it. I start from the artist's earliest extant recordings and proceed chronologically from album to album, including any non-album singles. I also include solo records from any prominent band member. I read up on each album as I listen, my version of liner notes, including any career or personal info that might somehow connect to the music. And I don't stop until I reach the last recording, which might very well be this year. This can be as few as 1 or 2 albums, like with the seminal punk band the Germs, or as many as 50 or more, like if you do the Beatles and then every Beatles solo career. There are so many reasons why this is a worthy undertaking. Greater appreciation for the artist's talent beyond their more popular output, better understanding of where the artist is coming from and what they're trying to achieve, discovery of hidden gems and creative offshoots they may not be known for, a detailed illustration of how the artist developed through the years, placing the artist's work in context, both as a part of their own career and as a response to the broader music scene. Oh, and it's fun and immersive, and most of the music is incredibly good. Plus, this is key, it takes a lot less time than you think, a lot less than binging a TV show, and you can do it anywhere. Now here's where it gets way better. A chronolography tells a story, not just of that music or that career, but of the times they existed, the people involved both in and out of the band, music development as a whole, how the industry and other external pressures influenced the music or definitively didn't, and even a chunky slice of society and humanity in general. It's like history meets documentary, mixed with a novel, and culminating in a time-lapsed work of art. It's so much more important than just a musical exercise. We all have preconceived notions of pretty much everyone and everything we've ever encountered. The judgments that shape those notions are largely based on the least amount of information possible. We might know a few songs or one era when the band was hugely popular, when commerce coincided with creativity in a big way. We decide if the band was good or worth liking just from that. And hey, that's fine if that's all you want to do because it's just music, right? No, not right. Why? Because for most people, how you approach one thing that matters is very similar to how you approach everything else. If you're content to settle for your own underinformed judgment on something as relatively simple as music, how likely is it you dig deeper when it comes to more complex subjects like politics or social or philosophical issues, or the sum total of a person's life? We get lazy in our thinking, curiosity, and action. We accept headlines and memes and shouting points as truths and as the whole story. We follow one source and base our judgments on whatever that source says. If it says a person is evil or awesome or incompetent or brilliant, we don't bother to find out how true or comprehensive any of that is. We end up building our own personal ethos on scraps of knowledge held back from knowing more by fear. And then we live our lives accordingly. I'm saying the foundation of our existence is built with partial truths, outright lies, prejudices, and fear. That by itself is sad, as is this culture's near hatred of true open-mindedness and inquisitiveness. But what's saddest of all is, just like with the chronolography, it takes so little time and effort to dig deeper, and we still don't do it. We have a right to our opinions, and to voice those opinions how we may. And we're not that different. If you're not bothering to absorb more of the story, chances are neither is the person you hate. What's left behind are not just the whole truth and context and perspective and all that good stuff, but commonality and connection. Those things we might see eye to eye on that might help us understand each other and ourselves and bring us together even in our disagreement. If binging on reality gets us closer to each other and to a truly full life, then those few extra minutes every day are worth it. So that brings up a lot, huh? You know, it's my little trick here with this kind of music is everything subsidiary of music is not a genre, that I take a musical concept and connect it to life. And, you know, for some people, that might be like, what, you know, that's kind of like what I said. Music is just a start, you know, and it's not really related to anything. How do you do that? For other people, they kind of see it, as I see it, which is, it's not that hard. There, you know, and it's like I've said in other podcasts, there are connections everywhere. And if you're really truly looking for connections, you'll find them, you know, and you will know if they are true connections, if, you know, they're actual, you know, verified connections. I've been through this before. That's kind of what I'm talking about here. But the point being, this is not such a big trick, you know, and yet this week in particular, this issue in particular, this subject is really, it's important to me on both sides, which is sort of always true, but in this case, it's like doubly and triply true. And because, you know, let's stick with how I ended my little, you know, reading here and talk about the real world concept of this. When I talk about, you know, immersing yourself in the full picture of something and understanding context and understanding a person or movement's place in history and understanding why society, you know, was a certain way at a certain time, or why a person might say a certain thing, you know, at a certain time in response to something else, or, you know, what the true full picture of any kind of subject or topic is based on, frankly, as complete a history as you can find. And yes, from multiple sources. You know, yes, if one source says, oh, this guy, you know, believes in this and did this, and that makes him, you know, a jerk or a saint, check that, you know, and see where else you see that, and see if that's been, repeated, not by sources that are connected to that other source, but by completely independent sources, and even some sources that you might not like, But the point of this is, when we ignore or deny or just kind of avoid looking into things, we are playing into our own laziness, our own fear, and distrust and all of that stuff. And those kind of things, they grow upon themselves. The more you are that way, just like any habit, the more you become that. And just like any habit, in fact, another music example, I know a lot of people who say, I'm not into new music and I'm kind of afraid to get into it because there's so much of it, I don't know where to start. On the outside, it seems that way. And I mean, yeah, in one sense, part of that is true. But the real truth there is, just like with looking deeper into an issue or a person's life, who a person is, or a chronolography, or whatever you want to say, it doesn't take that much time. It doesn't take that much effort. You want to get into new music, you find a source that you trust and you start there, and then you expand from there and see where it goes. And you will all of a sudden start saying, oh, I like this, I don't like that. And before you know it, you're into new music. Not, any large percent of it, because none of us are. But enough of it that you're now a part of the contemporary music world with, I don't know, anywhere from 30 minutes to 5 minutes of effort. And that can apply to every single other topic, subject, thing in the world. If there's something out there you have a strong opinion of, or that means a lot to you, or means a lot to people you know, and you have a certain impression of it, and that impression is causing a certain emotional response, a certain intellectual response, all of that is valid. But my contention is, don't trust the first impression. It may be right, it may be the whole truth, it may be just part of the truth, or it may be completely untrue. There's a huge value. Things like fear and anger and all that stuff diminish greatly. I mean, this is just fact, whether it's science or anecdotal, it's fact. Those things diminish greatly the more that connection happens, the more that discovery happens. That whole knowledge is power idea, that whole, the things we don't know, we fear. When you know them, it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to change your opinion. And my belief is this: if you're afraid that learning more about something is going to change your opinion, then how strong was your opinion to begin with? How well-founded is it? Or how much do you really believe it? Are you clinging to it because it's a comfort, and things like that? And, a lot of that stuff, it doesn't come from people. I've had this discussion with a lot of people. And the thing is this: as a prejudice, a person who's smart, who's inquisitive, who's always looking for more of the truth, or more of the picture, etc., might make a knee-jerk judgment about someone who doesn't do that and say, oh, they're dumb, But that is just not true. First of all, that's a judgment call 100% across the board. Like dumb, smart, all that's a judgment call. But second of all, it's not about how intelligent you are, or how your brain works, or anything like that, or how people judge that. It's about the willfulness of how you decide you're going to live your life. If you're going to live your life as a person who says, oh, no, I'm not going to read that, I'm not going to look into that, I'm not going to watch that, I'm just going to kind of, whatever it is I listen to or watch or read, I'm going to take in, that's going to be enough for me, that's it. That's not stupidity, It's just intellectual laziness, It's an emotional blockage more than anything else. And that's the part, like I said, that's the part that's the saddest to me, and the most frustrating, because though that small but extremely powerful bit of a blockage and laziness is really the cause of, you know, almost 100% of everything that happens to any large group of people in this world, or even an individual. In that, like I said, we're basing our own personal beliefs, our ethos, on the limited amount of knowledge we have that comes from not wanting to know more because of fear. And if you extrapolate that and say, then everything we do and say is based on that, you know, how crippled we are as humans in a society if we're interacting with other people or with other ideas based on that. So you can see how, if you make that broader, how a bunch of people who have that same mindset about a same thing will then, you know, band together in a certain way and become this, you know, us group. And then the them group are the people who believe something opposite. And it doesn't mean that those things are things that you will all of a sudden disbelieve. You may really staunchly believe something that someone else believes the opposite of. But in between all of that is the connective tissue that makes us all part of this world. And the thing is, there's way more connective tissue than there you know, are differences. Just like we may not look a bit like our neighbor, or talk like them, or act like them, and yet, you know, and you know, you do DNA test, you know, obviously you're gonna get two different results, and yet, like, that's like 99.9% of, you know, is how much we share with that other person physically, you know, and even the way the brain functions and all of that stuff. Vastly more connective tissue, you know. And the you know, one quick other point before I get into the second part of this, which I'm psyched about, is that a lot of this stuff is propagated hugely by people who have agendas, you know, whether it's a personal agenda or it's an agenda of power or money or fame or things like that. And so, you know, our willingness to accept what's being fed to us and not looking more into it, whether it's laziness, fear, whatever you want to call it, is being compounded and promoted by those forces. So we are, you know, even the people we dislike the most and we disagree with the most, many of them, you can't say all, you can't ever say all, but many of them are victims of the power structure and the, you know, systemic issues in this world, and how fear is promoted and stuff like that. So, you know, look into things and whatever else I was saying. That's very important, but I'm done with that section. I'm going back to the beginning of this talk into music, and I'm going to do something a little different from what I normally do with this Music is Everything edition of this podcast, and that is I'm going to take a specific band and dive into that band and explain the chronologography of the band to illustrate how awesome it is and how it works, right? And that's where the title comes from. If you are alive and breathing and past a certain age, you know of a band called the Bee Gees. Odds are, when you hear that, most people initially will think disco in the 1970s and Saturday Night Fever. If you're older or know a little more about their music, you might think the kind of psychedelic pop and soft rock of the, you know, or even early rock and roll of the 1960s and early 1970s. But beyond that, I would venture to say that the majority of people don't know anything else. You know, they might know there were three brothers. There was a fourth brother who had a solo career. 3 out of 4 of them are now dead. You know, kind of factual stuff. You know, that they existed and, you know, did music beyond that. Maybe you don't even know that. But chances are that's, you know, if anything, their disco period and their period before that. Now, Yes, part of this was prompted by the awesome documentary that came out shortly before the recording of this podcast. And, but most of it was prompted by me deciding, finally, I'm going to knock them off my list. I have a list. If I've done, let's say, 54 bands with substantial, substantial output, their entire career and the solo careers of certain band members, there's probably another 100 on the list that I really do want to get to. And the Bee Gees were one of them. And I said, well, this is a perfect time. Why would I not do it right now after being inspired by that documentary, et cetera, right? So I went, and just like I said in the beginning of how I do a chronolography, I went and took a look at their discography online. I dial everything up either on Spotify or YouTube. That's just, if you can't find it in those places, search a little more. You might find something that's not on there, but chances are you won't. That's just kind of how it is. There are a lot of things on YouTube that aren't on Spotify for one reason or another, probably because they were not reissued by the whatever record company owns the rights. So I went back to 1963 when the brothers were in their teens. I think they were all in their teens. It might have been, no, I think they were all in their teens. And they, of course, were from Australia, although, born in Britain, so they're, that kind of, they have like dual touchstones as far as where they're from. And they released a bunch of singles from 63 to 64 that were not on any album. Their earliest recordings, I believe most, if not all of them, were written by Barry, the oldest. And listen to those. And then following that, and again, this is not on, this I found on YouTube, 65 and 66, they released 2 albums only in Australia. And again, most of those songs were written by Barry. And they were pretty awesome. I mean, those albums in particular really reflect the kind of Beatles influence and the skiffle and all the things that were going on at the time in the early 60s in Britain and apparently in Australia and eventually in the States. And you can hear that. And to hear a band that you think of as, slick dance disco music or psychedelic pop, just straight up rock out, in that early kind of rock and roll way, or mid-period early, is amazing. It's awesome. And there are songs where they sound tremendously like the Beatles or like other British invasion bands. And yet, those 2 albums did not cross over. Someone from Britain heard, I think, the last one, the second one, and they were brought over to Britain to record the next one, which is the first of, I believe, 4 albums released from 67 to 69 that were all done, that were all released internationally. And that's when they broke. That's when they broke in the States, which is where we started to, this is where our consciousness of them, really began, chances are. Although if you're listening abroad, hello, I want to visit you. And those songs had some of that early rock and roll and were diving into like psychedelic pop and the Summer of Love kind of pop and really chamber pop and dream pop and all of that thing with, again, elements of rock, and really solidly established them as hit makers, like huge hit makers. Words and I Started a Joke and the New York mining disaster 1941, I believe it's called. Yeah, I'm terrible with names, terrible. That was their first period of huge success, to the point where Robin, one of the twins, Morris is the other, of course, decided, I need to spread my wings. And he went out and did a solo album. And so the next album they did, which I think was in 70, was just Barry and Morris. And Robin put out a solo album, which was decent. It got good reviews back then. I listened to it. It wasn't my favorite thing. But it was cool to hear. And like I said, I do the solo albums when it is germane. Morris and Barry also did solo albums back then. They weren't released to the point where you can't even find them on YouTube. There's a single, I think, from each one of them that I heard, and they were, again, also decent. They all got back together, and during this period from 1970 to 73, they really explored more of kind of the soft rock and folk and even a little bit of a country tinge and got more experimental. They did a concept album called Odessa and stuff like that, and Robin came back after that one hiatus, and they had a few hits, but were kind of declining in popularity. And I guess they felt it. They knew they wanted to branch out and do some more things. They always had an interest in American soul and funk and things like that. So starting in 1974, they changed producers. They got more into that. And for the next several albums, through, of course, the Saturday Night Fever soundtrack and their also smash hit, the follow-up album to that in 1979, Spirits Having Flown, they were just disco and funk and soul and R&B and, a little shades of their previous incarnation, but no real trace of their early kind of rock and roll or psychedelic stuff. They were immersed in the pop and the disco and funk and all of that stuff. And what's cool about that is we think of that period, we think of the movie, boom, that's it. There were, I think, 3 albums before that movie where they were exploring this type of music. And 2 of the very well-known songs from Saturday Night Fever did not originate on the movie soundtrack. They were on previous albums. There's a song called Jive Talkin', which was their first hit in their new incarnation. I think Nights on Broadway was somewhat of a hit too. And then the second, the follow-up, the next album, You Should Be Dancing. It was a surprise to me and I love this, one of the things, surprises, going through this chronolography. You find out things that you didn't know that they're like mini mind-blowing things. You Should Be Dancing didn't originate with Saturday Night Fever. Now, those 2 songs were put on the soundtrack, of course, and honestly, it's what prompted them, Robert Stigwood, to work with them and say, oh, if I'm doing a movie about this article, about the disco scene, well, you guys, it just converged to the point where their style fit that perfectly, and that's the period we know them best for. But if you know anything about music history, and this is where the whole broader music history comes in when you're doing a chronography like this, you know that there was a giant backlash to disco. Disco sucks era. You either like disco or rock and roll. Now, as I talked about this in other podcasts, so I'm not going to go deep into it except to repeat, because I think it bears repeating, that the primary backlash for this was because disco was rooted in the cultures of, LGBTQ and people of color. And so naturally, mainstream America, once they started getting more wind of this, were like, no, white bread rock and roll, fuck all those people. And so, they convinced a lot of listeners that disco was terrible music, and that which unfortunately, other things like soul and funk got lumped into there, and the whole thing crashed and burned, along with the careers of many of those people. Some were able to transition out of it, do other things, but very, very many were not, Fortunately, a lot of that music came back in the 80s in a different form, dance music and, and that kind of 80s, pop dance and stuff. Very happy that, that happened. And again, I did an entire podcast on the history of dance music from that period. What the Bee Gees did, unfortunately, was they crashed in terms of popularity, in terms of record sales, in particular in the United States, although I think in that period elsewhere as well. From 81 to 87, they only released 2 albums in those years. And neither of those albums did very well. So they branched out, and Barry wrote, and the others, but especially Barry, wrote songs for other people, like the huge hit Islands in the Stream for Dolly Parton and Kenny Rogers, and so many other hits. He did some stuff with Diana Ross and I believe Tina Turner and Donna Summer and some people like that. So they're survivors. They're the songs were the thing for them. Whatever style they were doing, if it's a good song, then and a good performance. So they worked with other people. And that's how they kept their spirit going in between those albums. Except for, and this is where it really got interesting for me, except for Robin, right? So Morris did a little something with a movie somewhere in the 80s. It was a very kind of country-ish kind of music, and it was kind of awesome. I like his kind of rootsy feel. Barry did his own thing with the pop music and the light soul music, however you want to call it, rubber soul as the Beatles called it, and that's what the name of that album really means, because rubber is light skinned, let's say. And then did a movie soundtrack for a movie called Hawks, I believe, in 88, I don't know, 86 to 88. But Robin put out 3 solo albums from 83 to 85 that were like new wave, techno, dance, pop. And I gotta say that most of that material is just freaking awesome. It's way different from any other Bee Gees stuff that came before it, and did actually influence a little bit of what came after it, Bee Gees wise. But it's like, I say it's like the alternate universe of 80s music, where in another universe where the people from the States didn't hang on to their prejudices based on the disco sucks and all of that stuff, this, they would have had enough cachet to have their stuff promoted more in the States, and this music would have had, there would have been several hits, 1 or 2 from the handful of Bee Gees albums, but I think quite a few from Robin Gibb's solo work. Look them up. 2 of them are on Spotify. 1 I had to go to YouTube on, but man, awesome. Just go do it. It'll change, I mean, all of this should, but this in particular will change your notion of who the Bee Gees were and somewhat are, right? And let me mention in passing that I did during this period listen to all of Andy Gibb's work as well, from the late 70s straight up until his death 10 years later. He had a very short career, and most of it was very sad because of his substance issues. And worth listening to, though, so check those out too. Then came, so they did that album in 87, didn't do that well. They might have had a little bit of play, internationally. Then came the next period, 89 to 91. This was their comeback. Not in the States, because, we hold on to our limited knowledge and prejudices, but in the rest of the world, they had a pretty damn huge comeback, especially their, I want to say their 91 album. One, I believe it was called, which I think the title track was a huge, huge hit. And I'm sad that I knew almost nothing about probably nothing about any of this music. Remember growing up in that era, being immersed in music of all kinds, and had no knowledge of any of this because they were blacklisted from the States still. Nobody would touch them, right? And they weren't yet at a point where they were like legendary or veteran status, even though by then they had been, performing for 25 years. They hadn't quite gotten there, so they didn't cross that threshold. So it was this between period, and that's sad to me, but worth looking up. There's some stuff like the 89 album, it suffers a little production-wise, and there's a little bit kind of a, treacly pop feel to it. But as with everything they do, every album is worth listening to. There's some great stuff on there. The 91 album, same thing. A little stronger, but same thing. And then, you look back to the periods in your music history that you loved the most. And you focus on the bands that you knew then. So let's say, for example, in 93, for me, in part, it was Nirvana, it was Pearl Jam, it was the grunge scene, it was, but it was also some of the pop stuff, or, it was Beastie Boys and some early 90s hip hop is, I think, my favorite era for that as well. What you don't necessarily think of is that most of the bands that existed before then that had any substantial career and success were still at it, doing their thing. Many of them just touring and maybe playing their hits catalog or whatever, but maybe an equal amount, if not more, putting out new material and really trying to make a go of it. And so I was looking forward to every period here. I always do, but in particular this period, because I was surprised to see the how many albums they put out. I think there were maybe 2 albums in the mid '90s, and then one in 2001, which was their last as a trio. And it was interesting to me to hear, well, where were they going to go with this? Were they going to cling to the kind of a light R&B pop feel with Robin interjecting some of his dancey stuff and all of that, or were they gonna be influenced a little bit by what was going on in the rest of the world? And it was more the second than the first. They got back to their roots. They got back to the way they wrote and produced songs back in the early 70s and the late 60s. Still maintaining some of that mid-70s flavor and funkiness as well for quite a few of them. And with Robin having explored what he did, he still brought some of that Euro dance kind of feel to a lot of what he did as well. And he was just an amazing songwriter and singer on his own. I'll keep saying that. And so those albums struck me as a real strength period for them, because they were able to abandon the so-called need to adhere to a certain production style. And they did finally pass that threshold where they were becoming, this kind of legends and veterans and people that were revered, elder statesmen in a way. And even though they only still, again, had very, very, very minor success in the States, all these albums did very well overseas. The 2001 album in particular, man, that's a powerhouse of work. And it's back to what I've said in other podcasts where, like, I listened to all of Rush's catalog. And I like their early stuff or their second period stuff when they were really developing. And then they went through their growing pains, or whatever you want to call it. And hardcore fans, I'm sure, love that too. But then when they emerged out of that and no longer had a need to worry about, adhering to a hit formula, their stuff, I think, in many ways was stronger than their earlier stuff, And a lot of what's on this 2001 album, I'd say the same thing about, right? And then, we get to the next, the second to last period, in the way I'm classifying it, which is in 2003, Morris died. And they decided, or didn't decide, or however it was, they wouldn't work. Morris was kind of the glue. He mediated between Barry and Robin, who were both had their differing ideas. In fact, I just saw an interview with Barry, and he again mentioned, Robin's difference in, musical philosophy and style. And we're talking, because he's just released a new album, and that's why he was interviewed, 2021 or 2020. And he's still talking about this. So there was a very slim chance they were going to do much work together without the glue. So, of course, Robin put out a couple of solo albums. He put out one solo album that, again, just incredibly strong. It was a little more evolved out of the dancey techno. Not that it needed to be, but it was. And a lot of it was just really, really good. And then, of course, he died in 2012 and was working on an album at the time, along with, I believe, some musical that never emerged. I think about the Titanic, I don't know, with his son, I want to say, and someone else. And his last album was released posthumously, and his son is on there quite a bit, as a matter of fact, and is a really good, strong, heartfelt album. I recommend that as well. It's 2014. It was released 2 years after he died. All right. And that's, I'll stop here before I get to the last period and just give you a quick rundown of, the brothers. So we know about Andy and his short life. He died at the age of 30. It's very sad. He had an amazing voice, very smooth voice, in many ways probably the smoothest voice of all 4 brothers. But his material wasn't at the top of my list. Great hits, though. I Just Want to Be Your Everything. Great song, things like that. He worked with Olivia Newton-John, another Australian, another great voice. Morris, the rootsier, had a more of a country blues. There's a song of his that was on one of the Bee Gees albums that he remade, I believe, later on in the 80s that I actually want to cover. It's that good. And his voice is just, I don't know how to describe it except to say it's just a solid, good voice that is grounded in his body, right? And, Barry, the one everyone thinks of when they think of singers for the Bee Gees, even though most of the Bee Gees hits were sung by both Barry and Robin in lead, sometimes in unison, sometimes harmony, and you often couldn't tell which was which. Except the more you listen, the more you can. And Barry's voice, I will say this, he transitioned really well into the falsetto stuff, right? Because he gave it a little grit in the way that like Frankie Valli gave falsetto grit. Not everybody does that, right? But his kind of rock voice had a beefiness to it that I missed until he started bringing it back a little bit. And I don't think it ever fully really came back, maybe by choice. But his is the kind of voice that when you hear it, you immediately know who it is. And that leaves, of course, Robin, my personal favorite, which is funny because their voices mesh so well and sometimes you couldn't tell them apart. And yet Barry's vibrato is like, watching a slow motion tape, right? And Robin's vibrato is as fast as you could possibly think a vibrato would be. It's like Tiny Tim's vibrato, right? Or close to that. And yet Robin had the sweeter voice. Robin did more with his voice, and it's because I think he was more curious about what else was going on in the music world, and so he wanted to get into techno and other forms of pop and dance and all of that stuff, and so asked of himself to expand in those ways, and his voice expanded in those ways. And so his, I think, arsenal of what he could do with his voice was just more expansive. And I actually started to identify a little bit more with Robin because of how much he didn't want to be hemmed in by genre, and by he wanted to learn how to do more with what he could do, either in his voice or songwriting, production, and stuff like that. And, so anyway, those are my takes. I'd love to hear your takes. But let's get to the last period, 2016 to now. Barry released 2 solo albums, both of which super strong. The 2016 one is great, honestly. It's really, really good. It's got a lot of freaking blues and roots, and it's a solid band album. And what we forget is that Robin and Barry played, Morris played bass and Robin played guitar. And I think Morris played some other instruments too. He might have been a drummer and stuff like that. I don't think Robin really played anything, if maybe a little keyboard, but Morris also played keyboard. Like, they were a band. Like, they actually were not just singers, fronting a band. They were also a band. And you can hear that on the 2016 Barry Gibb album. And then 2021, like a week or two ago, he released country versions of hits from the Bee Gees in his solo career, and with featured artists on each one. And like any of those albums, I don't care if you're talking Tony Bennett's collaborations or whatever else, they're always hit or miss for me, based on A, do I like the other artist, and B, what kind of compromises are being made in the production and the performance to accommodate this other artist. Some of those songs are super, super, super worthy, redos of the original hits, and others are nice. None of them are bad, but that's where we are. So this chronography took us, and it was Barry saying, I want to get into country because I've always been in the country, and that's also cool. Olivia Newton-John's on there. She has way more of a country background than people realize, because again, they think of Grease or I Want to Get Physical, right? Anyway, this chronography took us from the early 1960s to today, to this very week or last week, and all the things that happened in between there. So you can understand why this is so exciting to me and why it's so valuable, and how these skills can be applied to things other than music. But I hope I hope you, kind of piqued your curiosity either to maybe dive into one of the artists that you'd like to know more about and go through their chronologography, or the Bee Gees in particular. And boy, there's vastly more about the Bee Gees that I discovered that I could possibly fit into a podcast. So whether it's the Bee Gees or some other band, I urge you to go do that. And then go do it with a subject that's, more pertinent to the workings of society and politics and stuff. And either way, I want to know what you think of all this. What do you think of the Bee Gees and my, complete opinions about who I liked better as far as the, brothers and their albums? What do you think of the whole idea of a chronologography, or how any of these skills apply to other things in the world? Comment. Let me know, because as always, my objectives here are music, conversation, and connection. Thank you. And thanks to all my Patreon supporters, and I'll see you next time.